Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second guest presentation of the year. We're delighted to have Dr. Alison Madelaine here this afternoon to talk to us about Tier 1 spelling instruction in primary classrooms. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. As we move through the seminar, if any questions pop up, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end. I will be sending out a recording of the presentation tomorrow. Feel free to share it far and wide. So I'll just introduce Alison. So Dr. Alison Madelaine is a Principal Research Fellow within the Multi-Lit Research Unit. She's currently involved in the development of whole class and remedial programs in reading, spelling and writing. Alison's also Clinical Director of the Multi-Lit Literacy Centres, where she oversees the delivery of Tier 3 literacy interventions to school-age students. She has had experience teaching students with reading difficulties in both Australia and the USA, and she's also provided consultation to the delivery of multi-lits literacy programs to disadvantaged students in several multi-lit projects. Alison has extensive knowledge in the development of reading and its related skills in literacy instruction and assessment. She completed her doctorate on curriculum-based measurement of reading and was a lecturer in special education with a focus on literacy at the Macquarie University Special Education Centre. Alison's currently a Learning Difficulties Australia and LDA Council member, and she also edits the LDA Journal, the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties. So welcome, Alison. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. I'm going to
Thanks, Maddie.
And I will leave you to it.
Okay, thanks, Maddie, and welcome everyone. Here is what I'm going to attempt to do today. So this presentation will address some of the problems with more traditional list-based spelling instruction and look at a more efficient evidence-based and language-based method of teaching English spelling to primary school students. So I'll be taking you through the components of spelling and spending some time discussing spelling assessment and looking at some considerations for using commercial spelling programs. And I've just popped invented spelling onto the end of my overview here because everyone always asks me about that. So hopefully we'll get time to do that as well. So I want to talk now about how spelling often has traditionally been taught. So a common approach to the teaching of spelling has involved the rote learning of lists of words, and the emphasis has been on the visual information that each word conveys. So if using this approach, a teacher might prepare a list of words for their students to learn for the week. This might be given to the students on Monday and they're tested on Friday. So those spelling word lists might come from other areas of the curriculum, from children's own writing, or from a spelling program. Sometimes it looks like they've just been sort of pulled out of the air. Who knows where they come from. So during the week, some light teaching may occur to practice these words. And students might be doing things like writing them out lots of times or writing the words in a sentence. But there is often little, if any, in-depth instruction around the nature of the English language to assist children in their understanding of how the system works. So the main problem with this type of approach or instruction is the absence of any real instruction in spelling. So let's consider this question, are word lists always a problem? So I just want to note here that it's important to remember that it might be a little unfair to completely dismiss the use of word lists as part of spelling instruction. So on the slide at the moment, you can see 3 lists. In example 1, the words are seemingly random. So the list includes words with many different types of phonological, orthographic, and morphological features. And I will explain those terms in a bit. For example, there are words with 1, 2, and 3 syllables, different digraphs, and different affixes. Lists of words that are completely orthographically unrelated promote rote learning as the main spelling strategy, excuse me, and force children to focus on the visual features of a word. So it's likely that the instruction that would accompany that first list would involve writing the words out many times, those same sorts of things. In example 2, the words are organised according to a theme. And I should have said earlier on that these 3 lists are from actual spelling lists that children have been given. So the words are orthographically unrelated again, and the list contains different examples of morphographs. So this list might be used during a history unit, and students would probably practice spelling these words in the context of writing about history. In example 3, the words are organised according to a common suffix, ION. So the spelling instruction that accompanies this list would include instruction in morphology where appropriate. So things like changing the bases act to action, donate to donation, and operate to operation. So using lists of orthographically unrelated words to teach spelling, as in examples 1 and 2, is more problematic than using lists of words that are related in some way, as in example 3. And that's because the amount of new information that needs to be learned in examples 1 and 2 is greater than in example 3. So in example 3, there is an understanding of the way English words work being built, whereas in the first 2 examples, it would be difficult for children to notice a pattern. So I want to move on now to how should spelling be taught. But before I do that, I just want to consider this question of whether it should be taught at all. So some believe that spelling skills can be acquired naturally by writing, and it's a little bit like the whole language approach to the teaching of reading. So this approach has been known as the spelling is caught approach. Others believe that it must be actively taught, and this is known as the spelling is taught approach. So to see which approach is best, we need to look at the evidence. And there is a growing body of evidence on the best way to teach spelling. But one source I wanted to draw your attention to is a meta-analysis by Graham and Santangelo published in 2014. So this meta-analysis found that spelling is taught approaches produced better outcomes than spelling is caught approaches. And if you're interested in reading this meta-analysis, there is a reference list at the end of my presentation, and I believe this article is freely available to download. So I'm now going to talk about 2 important features of effective spelling instruction: language-based instruction and explicit instruction. So what do we mean by language-based instruction? So language-based instruction occurs when children are taught linguistic concepts as part of their spelling instruction. So examples of linguistic concepts are things like speech sounds, grapheme-phoneme correspondences or phonics, word origins, meaningful parts of words, and rules and patterns or spelling conventions. So essentially they are being taught about how the English language works. And this type of instruction allows children to spell many more words than they could possibly memorize. And a little later in the presentation, I will unpack this a bit more and look at the actual components of a language-based approach. Spelling should also be taught using explicit instruction. So this refers more to the general instructional principles used, and it includes things like well-sequenced lessons, clear and concise language, use of guided and independent practice, feedback and correction. So this should be given during the lesson rather than days after a spelling test when kids have forgotten what they wrote. Giving a high number of opportunities to respond. So we often use techniques like choral responding and small whiteboards to make sure children are actively engaged in the lesson and have lots of opportunities to respond. And if they have lots of opportunities to respond, they also have lots of opportunities to receive feedback. So if you are interested in finding out more about this, a really good resource is this book by Archer and Hughes. It's not a new book, but it's a bit of an oldie but a goodie. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the language-based spelling instruction now to unpack this a little bit. So just to give you a little bit of history, it was once thought that children progressed through a series of stages when learning to spell, that they started in a phonological stage and then progressed onto an orthographic stage and then moved on to a morphological stage. So researching this area progressed, and it was then acknowledged that those stages could sort of overlap somewhat. But where we have arrived at now is that children use phonological, orthographic, and morphological skills to spell from the very beginning stage of their spelling development. So this is known as triple word form theory. So looking at those three areas. In addition to these three components, children also use etymological information or knowledge of the origins and history of words when they spell. So I'm going to be talking through that a little bit also. And then finally, irregular words are always something that causes a challenge for students. So I'm going to be saying something about those as well. So let's start with the three components of triple word form theory, the first one being phonology. So phonology for spelling includes children using phonological awareness, and at the level of the individual phoneme, this would be phonemic awareness, and their knowledge of grapheme-phoneme correspondences or phonics to spell words. So in order to spell the word shop, you need to be able to break that word into three sounds, sh, o, p. Then you need to know that the sound or phoneme sh is made up of the letters S and H. The phoneme O is represented by the letter O, and the phoneme P is represented by the letter P. So this information allows you to spell the word shop out loud, S-H-O-P. But if you want to write it down, you need some additional skills. You need to know how to form the letters used to spell each of those sounds. So a lot of this very basic information will form part of a reading program to decode words, but of course this is also necessary for spelling or encoding words. And for this reason, spelling and reading instruction should be very closely integrated, at least in the very first years of school, probably the first 2 years at least. So orthography refers to the rules and conventions of a language, in this case, English spelling. So it's things like learning about the position of phonemes in words. So we can't end words with the letter V in general in English. Learning about permissible spelling sequences, so P-L-A-Y, not P-L-A-I. Other spelling rules and conventions, for example, the softening rule, C saying S if the next letter is E, I, or Y, as in centre, city, and cycle, or G saying if the next letter is E, I, or Y, as in gentle, giant, and gym. So it is really helpful to teach students some of those rules and conventions. Of course, there are always going to be exceptions, but don't let that turn you off, because they can get so many skills from learning about those rules and conventions. Okay, and the third area of triple word form theory is morphology, and I'm going to spend a little more time on this, not because it is more important than the other areas, but just because we probably don't have enough time to go into depth with each of the areas. This one might be less known about than the other two. So as teachers, we can start developing children's knowledge of morphology in the first year of school. So we can start with some really basic concepts like adding suffix s to words to indicate plural. Many children will have a concept of plural or more than one from quite an early age. And the ability to use this information has implications for word reading and reading comprehension, but in this presentation, I'm referring more to teaching children to use this information to spell words. So as children move through the grades, instruction in morphology should include the correct terminology. Teaching children the meanings of important terms such as base, prefix, and suffix is a good place to start. On the screen at the moment are some child-friendly ways of explaining the terms to children. So the base would be the part of the word that gives us the main meaning of the word. And note that we use the term base to include base words and word roots, as there sort of tends to be some confusion between those terms. So the base can't be broken down any further in terms of its meaning. Then a prefix is a letter or letters we add to the beginning of a word to change its meaning, and a suffix is a letter or letters we add to the end of a word to change its meaning. So teaching children to apply their knowledge of morphology for spelling is a more efficient way of spelling than using visual memory to spell words. We know that knowledge of phoneme-grapheme correspondences can help students to spell lots more words than they could possibly remember. Morphology can be used to spell words in much the same way, but the morpheme or the unit of meaning is the building block rather than the phoneme or the unit of sound. As children move through the grades, they should acquire increasingly complex morphological knowledge. So we've had a look at a simple example teachers could introduce in the foundation year of school, the suffix s to indicate plural. By about year 3 or 4, students should have acquired many more affixes they can use to help them spell words. For example, the base hope and some suffixes can be used to spell the words hopeful, hopeless, and hopelessness. The word agree, or the base agree, and just one prefix and one suffix can be used to spell agreement, disagreement, and disagree. So both of these examples involve just adding prefixes or suffixes, so it's relatively easy. But with some words, of course, a spelling change is necessary, and this is where it can get quite challenging for some students. So for example, in the word running, we double the final consonant before adding ing. And in happiness, we drop the y and add I before adding the suffix ness. At a more advanced level, morphology interacts more and more with etymology, which is the study of word origins. By upper primary and into the secondary grades, students should be using more advanced morphology to help them read and spell words. So with knowledge of the spellings and meanings of these word parts, more complex words can be spelled and used in writing. For example, biography means writing about someone's life. Biographer means a person who writes about someone's life. Autobiography means writing about your own life. And autograph means to write your own name, and this is used as a way of identifying yourself. So these word parts will come up in other words, so spellings can be used again and again. For example, the word part bio in biology or graph in calligraphy. So as you can see, in addition to its interaction with etymology, morphology also interacts with vocabulary, and in addition to assisting students to spell words, morphology can also help them work out the meanings of words. So earlier when I talked about terminology, I talked about explaining base to students. So traditionally, this is sometimes called a word root. They get a bit mixed up, but we choose not to teach that term, just base. But we do teach students about two types of bases, free bases and bound bases. So free bases can stand alone as an English word, for example, the word help. And the example on the slide at the moment is the bound base ject, which means to throw. So it cannot stand on its own, and it needs at least one other morpheme to make it a complete word. On the slide now is an example of a morphology matrix using the base rupt, meaning to break. So note that rupt is also a bound base, as it cannot stand alone. It needs at least one affix in order to form a complete word. So students can use a morphology matrix to spell lots of words. In this case, some examples are disrupted, corruption, and interrupting. If we look at the word disruption in more depth, dis means apart. So disrupt means to break apart or to prevent something from happening as expected. And then the suffix on the end, it gives further information about past tense. And I also wanted to make the point here that you as the teacher can control how many and which word parts you put in a matrix like this. So you can enter only the word parts that you have taught or are currently teaching. Also, when students have learned to spell more word parts, you can add more in and make them a bit more complex and challenging. So, for example, you could add in the suffix ure, indicating the result of a verb, so students could then spell the word rupture. Here is another example of a morphology activity. This is a word building activity. It's a similar sort of activity where students are combining word parts, and here they're using the base tract, meaning to pull. So this particular activity is aimed at students in Year 4. And examples of words they could make are extract, extracted, distraction, distracting, subtract, contraction, attractive, tractor, contract, subtraction. You get the picture. There would be others. Okay, so you might be aware of the term phonological awareness and what that means, which is the ability to analyze and manipulate the smallest unit of sound within words. But you may not have come across the term morphological awareness. This is very much the same as phonological awareness, except that what is being manipulated is units of meaning in words rather than units of sound. So researchers found that children as young as 5 years old have some level of morphological awareness and that this increases with age. And the types of activities that increase morphological awareness include morpheme segmentation, word sorts, and word building tasks, just like the one we just had a look at. And these should all be part of a Tier 1 instructional program in spelling, and they will be found in good published programs. The research suggests that interventions in morphological awareness have benefits for children with poor spelling and also in other areas like word reading, reading comprehension, and oral vocabulary. So obviously morphology is an enormous area of study that would be impossible to cover completely alongside everything else students need to know about spelling. So in order to cover off the most important and useful aspects of morphology, it is recommended that schools have a scope and sequence for introducing morphology to students across the grades, alongside other spelling skills, of course. So this will necessarily incorporate a lot of review and will also make sure that important information is not left out. Commercial spelling programs should have a scope and sequence included with them. Alternatively, if schools are doing their own more bespoke spelling instruction, they can develop their own scope and sequence, or they can adopt one that has already been developed. I'd like to talk a little bit about etymology now. So this is the study of word origins, and it includes things like words borrowed from other languages. For example, lasagna, pizza, piazza, borrowed from Italian. Ballet chef and parachute, borrowed from French. And words like pharmacy, chemist, and photograph, while they're not direct translation, when they're not Greek words, they do have components in them that come from the Greek language. So PH saying f and CH saying k come from the Greek language. So you get words like pharmacy, chemist, and photograph. Etymology also includes words with a common meaning element. For example, unicycle, unicorn, and unique all have the common element uni, meaning one. And twice, 12, 20, and twin also they all have something to do with two, as indicated by the TW. In addition, the history of words is a big part of etymology. For example, the silent K in knife was once pronounced. And we included this in one of our lessons, and the children thought it was hilarious to say knife instead of knife. So it's not clear exactly when etymology should be introduced to students in primary school. In our spelling program, we've chosen to start introducing some etymology from year 3. But as I said, there's no indication of when that actually should happen in the literature. Okay, irregular words. So these are often quite challenging to spell because they tend not to follow rules. They break all the rules. At Multilit, we call them tricky words in our programs. Traditionally, they have been referred to as sight words, but this has proved to be a bit of a problematic term as it can mean more than one thing. So irregular words are words in which at least one letter doesn't make its most common sound. So some easy examples are words like was, of, and said. The other example that everybody always sort of trots out is yacht, and there are lots of others. And unfortunately, a lot of these words are quite common and needed for writing. So we really need to make sure students can get on top of these. So research is still evolving in this area, and there is still a lot we don't know about how children learn to spell irregular words. Current best practice involves having students make use of their phonics knowledge for parts of the word that it works for. So we call this the regular part of the word. Then instruction focuses on the tricky part or the irregular part of the word. For example, in the word said, knowledge of phonics works for the first and last letters, no problem. The middle 2 letters are the tricky bit, so that's where instruction is focused. And this makes learning a little bit more manageable because less needs to be memorized. Of course, in time, we want our students to be able to spell these words automatically in order to use them in their writing. Okay, I'm going to attempt to show you a video now, but I'm not quite convinced that the sound is going to work. If it doesn't, Maddie has assured me that she will send this link out with the recording for this presentation. So what I hope you're going to watch, either now or later, is a video from the SpellX spelling program. And I've used that just because that is what I have access to in my work. So as you watch, you should notice some of the features of explicit instruction, such as frequent opportunities to respond and guided practice. You should also notice some features of language-based instruction, such as the teaching of spelling rules and conventions, the teaching of morphology, and identifying and spelling the schwa sound in words. So the video goes for about 5 minutes, and I'll keep my fingers crossed. I'm assuming Maddie will let me know if there's a problem.
Write mass plus the suffix IVE in your book and write the whole word. Once you've done that, I'd like you to turn to a partner and share a sentence with the word massive.
There was a massive volcano that destroyed the city Pompeii.
Look at the end of these words. What do you notice? Especially about the last 2 letters of the word. Every word ends with the letters BE. So remember our fun fact, a word is almost never allowed to end with the letter V on its own. Here is a little rhyme to help us remember this rule.
A V on the end, C. What it means is a silent V.
Stella wonders what these shorter words are called and how we spell them. Let's help her find out. Let's look how to change have not into haven't. First, we cross out the O in not. Next, we pop an apostrophe in the place of the O, and then we slide the word parts together. What do? We cross, pop, we slide. Okay. Now it's your turn to change have not into haven't. Boards ready? So I want to see the cross. I want to see the pop. And then I want to see the whole new contraction, haven't, underneath. So who knows what homophones are? Remember what they are. George, what's a homophone?
Two words that sound the same but have different meaning and spelled different.
That's right. Well done. They share the same sound. So there's that phone meaning sound again. Phoneme and homophone both have something to do with sound, and they both come from the Greek language. So you can see when we know the meaning of word parts from other languages, we can use this to help us spell. We can also use this to work out the meaning of a word. William's army invaded England and he became king. The Normans spoke French. When they invaded, they brought their language with them. Many French words became part of the English language. You can tell the words are French by the way they are spelled. What word was that?
Reactive.
Reactive, well done.
But reactive doesn't have a.
Oh, hang on.
Yes, it does.
It does. Ooh, what is the prefix?
Re.
Re, what does re mean?
Like, do it again.
Yeah. So what's the base, Jordan, in reactive? Nice work. Listen for the sound at the end of each word. Paper, author, nature. What special vowel sound can you hear at the end? Jared. It's the sound, which we call what? Schwa. Everyone say schwa. Amazing. Now, we're going to look at the sound boxes in part one. The blank box is for the schwa sound. You need to think about which letters spell the schwa sound in paper. So if you can tell me, what two letters spell the schwa sound in paper, Ava? Fantastic. So you're going to fill in ER in that box at the end of the word paper. The last word, where there are no boxes filled in, is figure. I wonder if you can figure out how to spell the word figure, and I'll give you a clue. Might have the same schwa sound as nature. Can you fill in those boxes for me, please? Right, everybody stand. We're going to sing our drop E song. Are you ready?
We drop the E.
Okay, hopefully that gave you an idea of what explicit language-based spelling instruction looks like if you haven't seen it before. Okay, I'd like to move on now to spelling assessment. So when I started this presentation, I described a typical scenario of more traditional spelling instruction where students got a spelling test every Friday. So I just wanted to say here that there is most definitely no need to test students' spelling every single week, as has been the case traditionally. And I think that where this comes from is the fact that when you're using list-based spelling that requires memorization, that sort of leads you into having to test spelling every week. Whereas if you're teaching your students about how the English language works, that need to assess specific words is removed because you're more likely to be assessing skills rather than words. So unfortunately, there's no one rule about how often to assess spelling. You just need to make sure you're assessing spelling regularly. So how often you assess might also be determined by your purpose for assessing spelling. For example, do you want to know whether your students have learned specific skills or words that you have taught? Or do you want to know how your class compares against other students of the same age or grade? Perhaps you want to assign a grade or score for reporting, or maybe you want to know whether your students are able to apply their knowledge of phonics or morphology to spelling. You might also be interested in identifying any students in your class who might be in need of extra support or intervention in spelling. So depending on what your purpose is, you might choose different spelling tests. So I'm going to talk about some specific spelling tests in a minute, but before I do that, I wanted to give you an overview of the two main types of spelling tests teachers use. So the tests will fall into one of these two groups, curriculum-based assessment and norm-referenced assessment. So curriculum-based assessment, it just simply means testing what you're teaching. So if you make up a spelling test yourself to give your students, that would be an example of curriculum-based assessment. And presumably when you do that, you're going to put words on it that you have either taught or have contained skills that you've taught. So if you're using a commercial program, a lot of the assessment that comes along with that will also be curriculum-based assessment. And those sorts of tests are useful for making instructional decisions like whether to move on with your instruction, whether to go back and provide more practice or review, or whether there's a small group in the class perhaps that needs some extra instruction. So norm reference tests, on the other hand, are more likely to be used if you're interested in seeing how your students compare to their peers in the wider population. So this is usually published standardized tests, and these tests measure how well students can spell novel words, and they won't necessarily include words or skills that have been taught. So these tests can be useful for identifying students in need of more support. They will show you which students are in the bottom quartile for their age. And they can also be useful for tracking spelling progress across a number of primary school years. So I've provided a list of some examples of spelling tests you might like to consider here if you're wanting to use more of a norm-referenced style test. Note that these would be in addition to any curriculum-based assessments you may use. And these are some spelling tests that I have used over the years and found to be helpful. They are all dictated spelling tests, and they provide different types of information. Some of them are more general measures of spelling skills, and some are examining something more specific, for example, non-word spelling. So I'd like to highlight the components of spelling test, which, as you can see in the list, there's 3 different versions of the components of spelling test. That will give you separate scores for those 3 components that make up triple word form theory. So phonology, orthography, and morphology. This can be really helpful for teachers because they can see whether their students are using those 3 skills when they're spelling words, and whether maybe they've got a deficiency in one type of word or one set of skills that can then guide their instruction in a particular area. So there's also another test that does something similar that has become available more recently, and that is the second to last test in the list, the Spelling Profile Assessment, or the SPAR. So this one was developed in the UK, whereas the COST tests are Australian. So all of these tests cover at least part of the primary school years. Some of them are geared to a particular age group. Some of them will go right across F to 6. The first 5-ish tests in the list are ones that cost money, and the last five, I think, four or five, are free tests. Yeah, so you have to really consider your purpose carefully. I mean, relative to reading tests, spelling tests are quite efficient to administer because you can generally test your whole class in one go, because they're mainly pencil and paper tests, although there are some that do have digital options to them. So yeah, consider your spelling assessment carefully, and what sort of information you want or need, so that you don't waste good instructional time on assessment. Okay, I'd like to talk now about the use of commercial spelling programs. Some schools opt to use a spelling program, and these often come at a financial cost, but in circumstances can be a very effective option for delivering spelling instruction. So I've got some considerations up on the screen at the moment for some things you might like to consider if you decide to use a published spelling program. You can find these things out before you spend money on it. So the first one is to ensure the program is evidence-based, or at least evidence-informed. So if the program is evidence-based, there will have been some sort of empirical studies conducted on the program. If it is evidence-informed, the program will draw on the wider body of high-quality evidence for good spelling instruction in general. So the second one is to look for any studies that have been conducted on the program and whether the results are valid. So to determine whether the results of studies are valid, it needs to be demonstrated that the gains in spelling skills of the students involved in the study were due to that spelling program or intervention and not due to something else. The third one is to ensure that the program has a rationale providing research support for the content and teaching techniques used. So if a good rationale is provided, there will be a statement outlining why spelling is being taught the way it is, with current references to the literature on spelling, including some empirical studies. Number 4 is to ensure the program uses a language-based approach to teaching spelling. So if the program uses a language-based approach, it will include more than rote memorization as a strategy for learning to spell new words. So strategies to develop spelling skills in the areas of phonology, orthography, morphology, and possibly etymology will be present. The fifth one is to ensure the program uses explicit teacher-led teaching techniques rather than simply involving the completion of workbook activities. So if the program uses explicit instruction, there will be clear guidelines regarding the presentation of new material, guided practice, and independent practice and review. So this may or may not involve the presence of scripted lessons. You don't have to have scripting to be explicit, but you may. And I just wanted to say there, what passes and has passed in the past for a program from some publishers is basically just a workbook. And often there's no instruction that goes along with it. The kids just go off independently and do page whatever, so that there's no actual instruction. So that's what we want to make sure a program has, is active teacher-led explicit instruction. Number 6 is to ensure the program presents a clear scope and sequence. So a clear scope and sequence would specify exactly what content is taught in the program and the order in which that content is taught. And the final guideline here is to ensure the program provides clear links between assessment and instruction. So if these links are present, teachers will know exactly how to place a child or a class in a program, how to monitor their progress, how to make instructional decisions about whether they can move on or they need to do some review, and how to determine when to finish a program. So if you decide to go with a spelling program, some examples of programs I'm aware of are Spelling Mastery, SpellX, which is the program I've been involved in the development of, and also Spell at Spelled New South Wales is another one. This is not a complete list. There are others available in Australia and elsewhere, and I'm not necessarily endorsing these programs. They are just some examples from reputable organisations. Okay, now I put this slide in at the last minute because everybody always asks me about invented spelling, because technically it's making errors. So when young children start to write, they generally know many more words orally than they can spell. So at this time, they're also learning to read. So their knowledge of letter sound correspondences is developing. They're learning all about phonics, and some of this comes through in their spelling. If they want to write a word, they will generally make an attempt based on any knowledge they have. So it could be just a first sound, or it could be quite plausible but still incorrect attempt. So it results in an error often, and it's called invented spelling. So sometimes this is referred to as inventive spelling or developmental spelling. And in the early stages of school, this is not a bad thing at all. It can indicate good phonemic awareness, and it shows the literacy knowledge that children are acquiring. So you can see some examples of invented spelling on the screen, and you've probably witnessed many examples of this in the classroom. And sometimes it's quite fascinating to see how children represent the sounds in the words that they are hearing. So it's not a problem in the first few years of school. Many of these errors will naturally resolve as children acquire more knowledge of English spelling. But if the students are getting up there in the grades, say year 4 or 5, and they are still doing this, it could indicate a problem with spelling or reading. So that would warrant more investigation. So I did want to highlight the word different here. So this word has what we call a disappearing syllable. The word has 3 syllables, but we often say it with 2. Different versus different. This is really confusing for students and is often why we get attempts like the one on the screen. One thing we can do to assist students with spelling is to get them to use what we refer to as a spelling voice. So that's often sometimes called spelling pronunciation or over enunciation. Students say different while spelling the word. Other examples would be chocolate or Wednesday. So that use of a spelling voice can help them to get all of those or represent all of those syllables when they're writing, and hopefully in time with lots of practice they will just learn to do it without the spelling voice. Okay, so just before we finish and have some questions, the main takeaway from this presentation is to teach spelling explicitly and in a way that teaches your students about how words work, how the English language works, so that they have more strategies to employ than just purely their memory. And this will hopefully set them up for more success when they are spelling on their own in writing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alison. That was highly practical and very, very interesting. Let me have a look. There have been a couple of questions, but I've managed to answer those myself. There's a couple more have popped up. There's a question from Catherine. She's curious about what spelling intervention programs are available for years 3 to 6. Are you able to?
Spelling intervention. I know that a lot of schools use spelling mastery, and they place the students where they fall rather than in a particular level that's associated with a grade level. So if they place in the beginning level, which is normally associated with year one, then that's what they do. So it's pretty easy to use the spelling mastery placement test to do that. I know that the Spelled Dyslexia Spelled Foundation have some spelling interventions also. I personally haven't used those, but they're a pretty reputable organisation as well. So I think they'd be worth having a look at.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Rachel. She has asked, how do you determine and insert syllable boundaries in words that contain double medial consonants, such as rabbit or middle? There seems to be a few different approaches in the literature. Is it it with the syllable break after the double B, or rabbit with the syllable break
Look,
between
I
the
seem
letters?
to remember reading somewhere recently, and I can't remember where it was, that it doesn't actually matter
That's
as long
right.
as kids can get the number of syllables. So technically, I think you would split it into rab bit, and then that would remind them that there's actually a double B in there. But yeah, I tend to agree with what I read. As long as you get all the letters and you get the right number of syllables, it doesn't necessarily matter where the breaks are. And I understand where you're coming from because I've seen lots of different ways of doing it as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. A question from Hedy. Should inventive spelling be encouraged when children say they just can't spell that word? Should the teacher say, just use the sounds that you know?
I think so because you can't provide instruction for every word that's going to come up in children's writing, particularly if they've got really good imaginations. And the other thing is when they're writing, we've got to sort of balance their spelling and their writing here. When they're writing, they're going to come up with better quality pieces if they're using more complex vocabulary, and that tends to be the words they don't know how to spell yet. So I personally wouldn't worry too much about it. I can remember having a child years ago that was trying to write the word listen and got so upset when he found out that it had a T in it, because he just couldn't hear it. I think just encourage them to go for it at that stage.
Yeah, which is it's a perfect segue into the next question from Rebecca, who sees students with lots of anxiety around spelling, which results in tears and then them shutting down.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any literature or further information about building confidence?
I haven't read any literature about building confidence in spelling specifically, but the approach I've taken in my own classrooms is to just normalize as much as you can making errors. I always used to point out when I made errors so that the kids knew that I made errors too. And the same applies to reading. You doing your small group reading and a child gets something wrong and someone else laughs, and yeah, just get rid of all that stuff and normalize making errors. That's the best way I can think of doing it. So it's just
Super.
not a big deal.
Great. Question from Kelly. Are pre-tests worthwhile in spelling instruction alongside placement tests, or is that just doubling up?
Well, they have very different functions. So placement tests are going to probably be more likely to be used for intervention, although you can use them to choose a whole class program. But of course, you've got to place your class at the same point unless you're going to use small group instruction, for example. I don't think they're doubling up necessarily. The purpose of a pre-test would be more to save yourself some time, wouldn't it, if most of the students knew how to spell the word. Now, if you're using a commercial program, that's going to be tricky, but if you're doing your own more bespoke spelling instruction, you could save yourself some good instructional time that way by using a pre-test and concentrating only on the skills that the students need to learn rather than stuff they already know.
Great. Yeah. There are no more questions outstanding. People are liking the points that you're making, which is great. So if there aren't any further questions, we have got a 5-minute early mark, which I'm sure people will be very grateful for, which is wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Alison. We really appreciate you spending this hour talking to everybody about effective spelling instruction.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.